The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, the CAF Philanthropy Series webinar. I'm Joanna Walker. I'm the head of private clients at CAF. And if you've tuned into us before, you'll recognise my voice in the previous broadcast. Thank you for joining us. We'll just wait a couple of moments for everyone to join, and then we can kick off with our fourth and final webinar for this year, which is on homelessness, the homelessness crisis in the UK. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce the webinar on homelessness. I am particularly interested in this myself because I think that it is something that we all know exists, but increasingly we are seeing much more of every day in and around the streets and the cities and the towns where we live and where we work. And what we wanted to do today was, as previously, bring together some of the leading experts in the field on the issue of homelessness to bring their different perspectives and help each of us understand what it is they're doing in the field of homelessness, what's causing the kind of increase that we're seeing, be it from the visible rough sleeping to the hidden homelessness, and how potentially we as a country and a community can help to improve the situation. Are there solutions that we can learn from other people for the longer term? The Sustainable Development Goals cited in Sustainable Development Goal number 11, which is around sustainable cities and communities, that by 2020 would ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums for those relevant countries. And I think this is something that we would like to talk about much here in that kind of context globally and what is happening in the UK. So as you may know, the format is not a lecture, it is a discussion. Please do get involved. We have questions for you as the audience throughout the session, so we'll be checking that you're paying attention to what our speakers are saying, and by all means do send in your questions through the chat function on the webinar software. You can send those at any time. We'll be asking questions throughout the session, but also have a real section for questions and answers at the end as well. So please send them through as and when, and I'll make sure that our speakers can answer those during the course of the broadcast. So, to kick off, I will introduce our speakers today. We have a fantastic panel of speakers for you, and absolutely delighted to have them here, so thank you to all of you for joining us. First of all, we have Hilary Burkett, who is the Head of Research at Shelter, the housing and homelessness charity. Hilary's been at Shelter for 5 years and also has a background in working groundbreaking research in homelessness and particularly in social housing sector. So, Hilary, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Secondly, we have Pam Orchard, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Connection at St Martin's in the Field. I hope I said that correctly, Pam. And Pam is joining us from the homelessness shelter that is literally just down the road from our office, so she was lucky enough to be able to walk here. And we'll be talking about the work that the Connection does with rough sleeping in central London and Westminster and the issues they're facing every day. So welcome, Pam. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. And our final speaker today is David Ireland, who is Director of World Habitat, which some of you may know formerly as the Building and Social Housing Foundation, who will be talking to us specifically about the international perspective on homelessness, particularly around Europe and what we could potentially learn from other countries in Europe. David was awarded an OBE in 2013 for services to housing. So, David, delighted you could join us today.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
Great, fantastic. So, before we hear from our first speaker, Hilary, I would just like to kick things off with our first audience question. So, question 1, how many people living in Britain today are considered homeless? Is it 150 to 199,000, 200,000 to 249,000, between 250 and just under 300,000, or over 300,000? So please do select which of those answers you think is correct now, before we move on to Hilary, who will be talking on the theme of the kind of macro view of the state of homelessness in the UK. have made your selections. We'll see what the audience thinks. The answer is just coming just now. Please do remember to vote. Okay, wonderful, thank you. So 33% of our audience think it's between 200 and 250,000. 17% think it's between 250 and under 300, and 50% think it's over 300,000. Hilary, perhaps you could tell us the answer as part of your presentation. Over to you.
Indeed, thank you, Joanna. And good to see we've got a well-informed audience, in as much that, shockingly, I think there are over 300,000 people homeless today in Britain. And I think I was as guilty as anyone before I started working at Shelter and in the housing and homelessness sector of really just thinking about homelessness as an issue of rough sleeping and the people we see visibly on the streets. But I think it's increasingly well known that the problem is much wider than that, and there's a large proportion of homelessness is not visible to us. It might be people who have spent the night in various shelters. There are a lot of people who are homeless but living in some form of temporary accommodation of varying degrees of suitability. Many families stuck living in a single room in a bed and breakfast, for instance. And we really are facing a housing emergency in this country at the moment, from the acute problems of homelessness that we see on the streets through to many families facing the risk of homelessness and the fact that we just don't have the affordable homes available for people who are facing these risks. And the risks are really higher than we might really anticipate. Our research at Shelter found that 1 in 3 working families today are only one paycheck away from losing their home. So basically, if their life circumstances change, they are not in a position to be able to kind of keep up their housing payments. So that is really concerning. So if we think about the problem of homelessness in a bit more depth, as I say, there are just under about 5,000 people sleeping rough on the streets on a typical night. But those are numbers we have seen kind of acutely increasing in recent years, worryingly. But that really is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There are far many more households who are recorded and recognised as homeless according to local authorities. Many of those people will be in some form of temporary accommodation. As we say, we see at Shelter many people, many families living in temporary accommodation, which is really unsuitable for their needs. That might be because they are living in, for example, a bed and breakfast, which just has shared facilities. They don't have any space to kind of cook for children to live or play or do homework. They may be just moved away from their schools or their places of work, and so really kind of facing really unsuitable conditions. And there was a lot more people who are just not visible to the authorities at all in whatever way. They might be sofa surfing or kind of staying with family and friends, but again, that might be in really kind of unsuitable ways. And then we know that there are many, many more people who are struggling with the housing environment in this country today and are potentially at risk of falling into homelessness, perhaps because they're paying a large proportion of their income on rent, or they're just living in really unstable or unsuitable conditions. So looking a little bit at why this is happening, actually the biggest cause of homelessness today is because households have lost the private tenancy. So they've been living in the private rented sector and have been evicted. And the main reason then that they become homeless is because they simply can't afford to find anywhere else affordable to live. The housing crisis is so great, and the cuts we have seen to benefits are so acute that people are really struggling to find anywhere else suitable to live when they lose a home. And this is tipping people into homelessness. And one of the other big factors which underlie the crisis we face at the moment is we're just not building enough homes, and particularly we're not building enough affordable homes. It's believed we need to be building about 300,000 homes per year in this country. We are generally struggling to reach 200,000, but we are getting very, very few homes which are genuinely affordable. Last year we had about 40,000 homes built which were affordable, but very, very few of those are for social rent, which is something we absolutely need to be tackling. in the past years, in the kind of post-war period, we were kind of routinely building hundreds of thousands of affordable homes, hundreds of thousands of social homes, and that has been dwindling over the decades, and to a point where really we're just barely building any social housing in this country at all, and that's something that absolutely needs to change. And we are, as I was saying, just have a crisis of welfare in this country as well in recent years, that we aren't keeping up with the rising rents, with the kind of housing benefit that's actually available to people. So if I can just talk a little bit about the work that Shelter does in the face of this crisis. Part of the work we do is obviously, importantly, providing help to people who are facing bad housing and homelessness, whether that be advice and support that people can receive across the country with our face-to-face advisors, or our national helpline, or our kind of the advice and information which is available on our website. We also provide a lot of kind of in-depth legal support to people. We've got a team of solicitors and legal advisors helping thousands of people access their rights, and providing them with kind of representation which can either prevent them from becoming homeless, or if they do fall homeless, actually getting them into more suitable housing. And another key thing we do at Shelter is recognising these kind of big structural problems that we face, which are causing people to live in bad housing and become homeless. We're trying to change the system and to live in a country where we're not facing this kind of housing emergency in the future. So we have run a lot of successful campaigns over the decades that we have existed. A lot of the housing rights that people have at the moment are in no small part linked to the kind of campaigning that Shelter have done across the decades. So the kind of rights we're defending at the moment are the kind of rights that we have kind of fought to be introduced, but some of the things that we've achieved in recent years include the introduction of legislation to ban upfront letting agent fees, which have been a kind of real barrier to people being able to access tenancies in the private rented sector, and campaigning to just get more affordable homes built, and we've been doing a lot of campaigning around that. So in summary, the kind of combination of these kind of services and campaigning are the kind of the main areas that Shelter works in, and it's always humbling to see kind of examples of the kind of work that we do actually helping people into kind of secure and stable accommodation. So this is one example on the screen there.
Wonderful, thank you. It's good to sort of see brought to life with Francesca's story there. And do you think the problem is getting much worse, Hilary?
We've certainly seen rises in homelessness across the piece, whether that be the people who are visibly homeless and rough sleeping in recent years, or the kind of the wider numbers of people in temporary accommodation rising in recent years as well. So yes, it has been getting worse, and we know that the kind of the wider systemic problems, like the problems of rents rising much faster than wages, have been getting worse in recent years. We know that in the last 5 years, rents have gone up about 60% faster than wages across the country. So yes, unfortunately, it's something we are seeing getting worse and more acute.
Mm. And the numbers you talked about in terms of the number of houses being built, I'm really staggered by just how incredibly low the number of houses are, certainly in affordable housing that you've got on your slide earlier on. Really quite shocking. If we're supposed to be building 300,000 each year and we're barely doing 40,000. Of those homes that are affordable, what proportion of those, the 40,000, was for the social rent that you described?
I think we had about 2,000 last year that were actually for social rent, because the government funding that's been available hasn't been available for social rent. So it's been really hard for housing associations and councils to actually build homes for social rent, which is usually at a much lower rent, particularly in the kind of areas of kind of highest housing costs like London and the South East, where it's really important to be able to get homes for social rent rather than the kind of higher affordable rents, which are what have been available to housing associations and councils more recently.
Gosh, that is extraordinarily low. And how many do you think it should be? What would be the ideal?
Well, we're actually working on that at the moment. Shelter is undertaking a commission on the future of social housing, which we will be publishing in the new year. And part of that will be looking at the number of social homes that we think need to be built. But it is certainly far more than the kind of numbers we've been achieving in recent years. So we've been looking at hundreds of thousands as opposed to a few thousand per year.
Oh, great. Do please share that with us when it's been published. David, you wanted to comment, I think.
I did, yeah. I think your graph, Hilary, illustrated just how few social homes are being built. But there ought to be another graph as well, which is that's the inflow, but that's the outflow as well. And the number of homes which have been lost to social rent through right to buy and actually through conversion into affordable rent, over the last 10 years, 400,000 have gone. So actually the net loss of social homes is not enough being built.
Yeah, okay. No, that's a very good point, thank you. And in terms of the government support available to people, of the different kind of levels that you described, sort of the hidden homelessness and the people at risk of homelessness, when does the government support kick in, and does it make a material difference to them at various points?
In terms of people being able to access temporary accommodation, as I say, that over the decades we have established some fairly good rights for some kind of sections of people who might find themselves homeless. So the fact that families can expect support in terms of being able to access temporary accommodation if they find themselves homeless is something we should be kind of proud of in this country. But the kind of major kind of factors of the fact we just don't have enough affordable housing for councils to be able to help people into kind of more permanent accommodation when they do find themselves homeless means that although we in theory have some housing rights for people who might be finding themselves homeless, it's often difficult for them to actually be able to kind of access and achieve those rights in practice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the government has recently, I saw, announced some money for long-term funding for affordable housing. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so welcomely, as I say, although we've been achieving very few homes for social rent in recent years because the government funding hasn't been there, it's quite recently the government's announced dedicated funding for building more social rent in the future over the forthcoming years, which is really welcome. It doesn't go far enough, but it's good to see the government talking about actually building homes for social rent and recognising the importance of that.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much, Hilary.
Thank you.
Fantastic. So now, before we move on to Pam, who will tell us about the connection and work they're doing with rough sleeping, it's time for our next audience question. What percentage of all rough sleepers in England and Wales, i.e. 8,000 per year, are based in London? Is it 10%, 15%, 25% or 35%? So please make your choices now. And while you're doing that, I'll just ask a question we've had, Hilary, from a member of the audience. Your graph on social housing being built showed that there was a collapse in 1979. Somebody's just asking what that was related to.
Really about government funding as much as anything else, and it not being available after that period.
Okay, thank you. Right, the results are just coming in, so do please make your selections on the percentage of rough sleepers in England and Wales who are based in London. Thank you very much. And the selection that 50% of you have said, 35% think it's 35%, 50% of you think it's 25%, and 15% think 15%. So over to you, Pam, to answer. What percentage are based in London? Do you tell us?
Well, I'll come on to that in a second.
Keep us waiting.
I know, it's very exciting, isn't it? So I'll just say a bit about the connection at St Martin's, if I may. We are based at the St Martin in the Fields site, just by Trafalgar Square on the end of the Strand, and we've been working with homeless people for well over 100 years there. The first documented activity was in 1917 when the vicar of the church, Dick Shepherd, provided shelter to soldiers travelling from Charing Cross in the First World War. After the Second World War, the charity was kind of professionalised to create something called the Social Care Unit, and that went through another merger in 2003 to form the connection at St Martin's. So that's kind of why we've got what we've got there. We are responding to very significant levels of rough sleeping, which is that tip of the iceberg that Hilary was talking about, in Westminster. So I'm going to give you the fantastic facts about rough sleeping in our local area. So actually there's about 8,000 rough sleepers in London a year. So that is about 25% of the total amount of rough sleeping in England and Wales. So about a third of London's rough sleepers, so about a third of that 8,000 people, are rough sleeping in Westminster. So there's a really strong concentration of rough sleeping in the centre of London, and 40% of Westminster's rough sleepers are in the St James's ward, which is where the the connection at St Martin's is based. So that's actually about 1,200 people a year just in this local authority ward. About 85% of rough sleepers are men, and about half of Westminster's rough sleepers are not from the UK. And that is a split of about 30% are from EU member states and 20% rest of world. So that gives you a bit of a sense of what the pie chart looks like. 40% of rough sleepers who are properly assessed, and that can be quite a tricky challenge in itself, have got both poor mental health and also some kind of drug and alcohol problems. So they would be described as people with complex needs. Rough sleeping is caused by a combination of a couple of things, really, broadly speaking. One of them is what we might describe as structural issues to do with policy, such as housing policy, approach to benefits, and Hilary's covered a lot of that really, really nicely. And then the other main set of causes is what I might describe as behavioural issues, which is the kind of decisions that people are taking about their lives that they've maybe got a bit more control over. So you might have things like relationship breakdown, use of drugs and alcohol, maybe gambling, that kind of thing. And it means that that complexity of both structural and behavioural issues can make it quite complicated and take quite a long time to get people off the streets. So this will give you a bit of a sense of what we do at the Connection. In that nice building next to St Martin's Infield Church on Trafalgar Square, we see about 4,000 people a year. We do a range of different things. So there's a set of activity which is about engaging people who are homeless, sleeping rough, hidden homeless, very hard to reach. So we do triage and advice about how to get people away from the streets and into accommodation. We've got an emergency night shelter for up to about 75 people a night. We do street outreach with people to try and help them to move into buildings-based services and into accommodation. We've got a range of practical support, which is things like food, toilets, washing machines, using us as a care of address for benefits, post and that kind of thing, and access to IT. We also give people access to primary healthcare services through work with the NHS, and that includes both mental health and physical health treatment, and we give people immigration advice. The second set of activity we do, which is a little bit more cheery, is about helping people to recover and move on. So we've got a recovery programme which has got a whole load of activities for people to get into, like art, gardening, and some what I would call psychosocial group work and support, like mindfulness and anger management and that kind of thing. We've also got a supported accommodation project in Clapham for 16 people who've slept rough, and we do work with people to help them to get a job. Or go into training or volunteering. And I thought I would give a bit of a sense of what some of the work we do with people is by giving you some vignettes of 6 different people. So late one Friday night, the police brought in a French man who was 63, very dishevelled and hadn't eaten for 4 days. He was very confused and tired, and he had very limited English. So we gave him a place to stay and a meal, and in the morning we tried to sort out what he was doing in central London with no money. He didn't have any belongings, but he did have a mobile phone and his French ID card. So we were able to contact his brother in Lyon, who was absolutely delighted and very relieved to speak to us because they'd been absolutely frantic. They knew that he had got very poor mental health and a bad memory. So we arranged for him to go home that day via Eurostar, and the staff took him to King's Cross, arranged for assistance on the train for him and to get off at the right place. He was met by a cousin in Lille, and they confirmed that they'd got him and he was back safe and well. Another one is a client who was found by the daytime outreach team with a long history of about 30 years of living on the streets in chaos, including drug and alcohol problems and mental health issues. He'd not slept inside apart from emergency shelters for over a year. So he came into our night shelter in early 2018. He's now working towards securing a tenancy, and he's engaged in our recovery programme so that he can help manage his anxiety and have diversionary activities while he's doing benefit claims. He said he was surviving, not living. And being involved with us has really helped him to be more positive, and he wants to get a job as a street cleaner, interestingly, because he wants to stay in contact with the streets, but in a kind of different way. There's a man who was tortured in his own country because of his religion. He escaped and came to Europe. He was too scared to approach the authorities and slept rough, started drinking, and he was kind of self-medicating, really, and his mental health really suffered. After quite a long time of trying to understand his situation and letting him into our emergency accommodation, he started telling us what was really going on for him with a support worker who spoke the same language as him. We linked him into mental health services and a solicitor who helped him to make an asylum claim. He obtained legal status and he's working now, renting his own flat. He's got married and he's got a baby. There's a woman who came to the UK to study, ended up working in a series of quite highly qualified jobs. After many years, she lost her job but couldn't evidence her right to work. She finished up all her savings, she became homeless and was sofa surfing. She couldn't get a copy of her immigration documents from the Home Office, but she was told there was nothing under her name. So we managed to, well, we believed her and her story, and managed after some tenacity to identify that her name was spelt wrong in the Home Office, and so that's why they had no record of her. We got copies of her files and established that she had the right to work and live in the UK. So we had a lawyer help her to get that documentation and get that sorted out. She's now in accommodation and she's working in a migration support service.
That's fantastic, thank you. And do you want to just sort of tell us a little bit about the kind of joined up responses that you do with other organisations?
I'm kind of concerned I'm running out of time.
Yeah, it's fascinating to listen to, but I would like you to get to that.
So we because people are very complicated and have quite complicated histories, we think it's really important that we work with other agencies in order to have kind of joined up responses. And homelessness is rising so much at the moment, it's really important that we make the most of the resources that we have available to us. So a couple of years ago, the European End Street Homelessness Campaign was launched by World Habitat, and there was a big street count in a number of different countries, a number of different cities, and Westminster participated in that. And from that, we've created something called Westminster Homeless Action Together, which is a strategic group of agencies, including the local authority and voluntary organisations who are working much more strategically to tackle the issues around homelessness in Westminster because it is so concentrated here.
That's great. It's great to hear you're working together with others, because I think that's something that people like to see, is that coordinated approach definitely makes a difference. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions from our audience. So just before we move on to our last speaker, Pam, you brilliantly segued into the campaign that David's organisation had run. Thank you. We have our final question for the audience. The average life expectancy of an individual in the UK is 79 years. But what is the average life expectancy of a rough sleeper? Is it 67 years, 57 years, 47 years, or 37 years? So please make your choices now. Will we hand over to David, who, as part of his thing, will tell us the answer to that question. It's sort of slightly shocking to me that there's a different life expectancy at all, quite frankly, but I do understand that there is. So we have the responses now, and 6% of people think it's 67 years, 22% say 57, 67% say 47, and just 6% think it's 37. So as I hand over to you, David, to talk to us about the European context and perhaps how other countries are tackling rough sleeping and homelessness and looking at this in a different way, perhaps you could answer that question as well as part of your...
Thank you. Yes, well the audience is right. It is 47 years. And you know, the shocking thing about that is that it's actually a worse life expectancy than somebody living in Somalia or Democratic Republic of Congo or even Syria or Yemen. It's worse than any actual country's life expectancy. But that's how dangerous it is to live on the street. There's our organisation, World Habitat, does a number of things, but it's about finding out things that work to solve the world's housing problems, and we try and scale those up. And one of the ways is what Pam just mentioned, the European End Street Homelessness Campaign, where 14 cities have signed up to end street homelessness and signed up to a number of principles about ending rather than managing street homelessness. But to go back to that point about 47 years, and trying to sort of picture what that means. Think about that difference, that loss in life of 32 years between your life expectancy as a rough sleeper and the normal life expectancy in this country. And I was thinking, what actually happened 32 years ago? And you might actually want to forget these things, but Maradona's hand of God goal, Wham being number one, or even a mini metro, which I'm embarrassed to admit I drove at that time, are things that happened, and it seems such a long time ago. It's a generation ago, but that's actually how much life you miss out on. Living on the street, and that's why it's so important that we tackle this. There's our organisation is looking at across the world, but looking at Europe, this map shows all the countries which are in red. Is where rough sleeping is increasing, and there's only one which isn't, which is Finland, which I'll come on to in a moment. And although it's measured in different countries, the rate at which it's going up is increasing, and in some countries at quite an alarming rate. And I'm sure many of you will have visited other European cities in recent years and seen the difference from what it was maybe even as recently as 10 years ago. But the good thing about this is there are reasons to be optimistic. There are some real success stories. I always think that street homelessness is a solvable problem. There are many social problems which appear intractable and insoluble, but this one is solvable, and we know it is because we've solved it before. We nearly solved this problem 10, 15 years ago in this country, and I'm sure you will remember going around the streets of London and how few street homeless people there were, even as recently as 10 years ago, and how it has increased again since. So we've solved this problem once, and we can solve it again. The other reason for optimism is lots of other places around the world which have solved it. Finland is the shining example in Europe where really it's the only country in the world which has actually ended street homelessness, and it's doing better than that. It's on target to end homelessness altogether. It's the only country in the world which you can talk about that in that context. And the way they've done that is they've just had a concerted government policy which has survived changes of government, which has put in resources and it's focused their whole housing programme around ending homelessness. And it works. And actually the problem in Finland 15 years ago was actually quite similar to the UK. So it's a solvable problem there. Amsterdam, if you visited Amsterdam 20 years ago, you may remember there was a horrendous amount of street homelessness. Lots of people attracted to that city in the same way that Pam was talking about Westminster. And you go there now, and there's actually very few. I was there a month ago and spent 3 days looking at homelessness programs and didn't see a single rough sleeper. And the reason is that they have bought accommodation. There is 1,000 new units of accommodation that's been bought for housing rough sleepers directly through a version of what's called Housing First.
And that was the government bought those units?
No, it was a combination of local NGOs with government subsidy, but a lot of it was private money as well, and philanthropic money. And the other one I just wanted to talk about was the United States. There's a lot of people quite surprised as the United States as an example. There's the expectation that homelessness is going to be worse in the United States, and there are some horrendous hotspots. But actually, the United States is a country which has seen a big reduction in rough sleeping over many years. Much of it to do with a campaign called the 100,000 Homes campaign, which started there about 10 years ago. And over 4 years, 105,000 rough sleepers were housed in permanent accommodation. And what is great about America is they continue to innovate, and their systems that they've got about measuring the numbers of people who have been rehoused, but also the numbers of people who are becoming homeless, and measuring the inflow and the outflow, and being alive to what is needed is really cutting edge. And you need those systems not just to reduce homelessness, but in order to keep hold of the gains that you've made. And there's an awful lot we can learn about what's happening in the United States. And the thing behind all of those three examples is something called Housing First. And you may have heard of this. But the diagram here, if you can just forget the colours and look at the shape, is a staircase. And that is the traditional model of solving rough sleeping, is that people get more and more permanent forms of accommodation as they demonstrate their what's called housing ready. It's a horrible term, but that's just the term that's used. The problem with it is it just simply doesn't work. And if you can think of people who have got a lot of needs, may have a lot of problems to resolve, actually putting somebody into a homelessness hostel with a whole load of other people with the same problems is not a great way to overcome things like addiction problems. And simply it doesn't work. What Housing First does is it reverses it. It puts people straight into permanent accommodation unconditionally. You don't have to prove or demonstrate anything. You're put into permanent housing, and then you're offered the care that you need once you're in there. And the success rate is much, much better. It's 92% in the United States, compared to probably single figures for the staircase model. And the other great thing about it is actually once you run up and running, it's not any more expensive. Better actually isn't more expensive in this case. Now the figures I've got here from America, and they're quite old. I think it's 2002, but they're the most reliable statistics that we've got on this. But every other study in every other country has shown a similar pattern, and that's that having somebody living on the street is actually very expensive. All the services that they make use of add up to an awful lot, whether that's through criminal justice system, through hospitals, through other forms of care. It adds up to a huge amount of money. Somebody even suggested recently that it's actually cheaper to house somebody in the Hilton on Park Lane than it is for somebody to be homeless. Housing First has got costs. There is the costs of that housing, and there is the costs of the assistance and the care which people have. But the other costs disappear. And so once you're up and running, it's actually not only better, it's cheaper. The problem is that in order to get there, you need the capital cost of providing those new homes. And that, I think, is where the opportunity lies for investment, social investment, and for more subsidy to provide those social homes that are needed in order to get into this better system that has worked so well in other parts of the world.
Thank you, David. That's incredibly interesting, actually, to hear from other countries who have effectively, like Finland, eliminated rough sleeping. That's quite extraordinary. And you mentioned in your piece that we used to be quite good at this sort of rough sleeping and did very well, and we're not anymore. We did a good job. So do please sort of expand on that, because it's slightly frustrating to hear, actually, that we had done a good job. And
it is really frustrating. You know, there was a thing called the Rough Sleepers Unit, which people may remember. It started in the late 90s and went on to the sort of early years of this century. And it massively reduced the numbers of rough sleepers on the streets, not just of London, but other cities in the UK. And it did that by a concerted effort. Also, I was working in local government at the time. I remember the concerted effort. That became #1 priority if you're in housing, was to end rough sleeping, and to get hold of the accommodation, to house people in it. And there was money made available to do it. I won't say the people's eye went off the ball, but other priorities took over. Those subsidy schemes came to an end. There was a lot of other reasons for people becoming homeless. More people became homeless, and the systems gradually sort of fell away again. So we've done it once. You know, that's the good thing, is we can do it. We just need to do it again.
Great, that's kind of inspiring to hear. And talking a little bit about the Housing First model that you described from other countries that could work here, I take it that requires a plentiful supply of housing, which, as Hilary has pointed out, doesn't necessarily exist at the moment in the UK. Is that right?
Well, it does. It requires social housing, not affordable rent or other. It requires social housing, and we still have an awful lot of social housing in this country. And through the system through local government is that people who are homeless have a priority for social housing in many cases. So there is a route in, but we haven't got enough, as Hilary explained so well earlier. We do need more, and we need other new models for getting more accommodation in. Amsterdam's proved what you can do. If you put your attention on getting that accommodation in, then you can very quickly, in fact, house people permanently and unconditionally. And once they're in there, they're no longer homeless. It sounds obvious, but actually that's the case.
Great, wonderful, thank you. Well, we'll be moving on to discussion with the speakers just shortly. Thank you, David, that's wonderful. So do please send your questions in and we'll get to those in a moment. I just wanted to open up the conversation between the three of our speakers really on some kind of topical issues. So obviously we had the budget yesterday, and one of the things that I was looking out for in advance of today was particularly any moves on universal credit, having sort of listened in the media over the last sort of 6 months or so around the impact on the implementation of universal credit and how it had led to some people being homeless. And I'd heard some sort of fairly horrendous case studies and stories on Radio 4. I just want to get your thoughts on universal credit, the impact that you've seen, Hilary, at Shelter, and how it's had an impact, and perhaps yourself, Pam, from the sort of the connection as well.
We are seeing a lot of people coming to Shelter for advice and help who have been negatively impacted by universal credit, be that the fact that they're getting less money now on universal credit once they're moved on to universal credit, or because of just the complexities of the system or it not functioning well. So people, having delays of receiving payments and things like that. So it's a combination of the fact that that people are getting just less money, and the fact that the system itself is not functioning very well. So obviously it's welcome that there's increased funding going into universal credit, so that the number of people who receive less when they move on to universal credit will be reduced. But the housing component of universal credit, the amount of money people actually specifically get for their housing, has not changed as a result of the budget. So we still have those freezes to the amount of housing benefit or support for housing costs within the universal credit. Remain the same, and those absolutely would need to be lifted if we want to reverse some of the problems we're seeing with people being tipped into homelessness as a result of their housing costs.
So that's the freeze on the amount of housing benefit that people can receive, is that right?
Absolutely. So that has been frozen over a number of years. So we're seeing increasingly the rents that people are asked to pay within the private rented sector are out of step with the amount of housing benefit that they can receive, and that is across the country really. That link has been broken, which means that people just can't afford the rents in the private rented sector if they need to get some support from housing benefit.
Right, thank you. And Pam, yourself, what are your experience?
I would really echo that experience from Shelter. I mean, we have seen people very significantly affected by the freeze in local housing allowance, and that's been in place for about 8 years. 2010, I think that came in. And in London and the South East, the disparity between the amount of benefit you can get and the amount that rent is much greater than it may be in other parts of the country, which is, I think, why you see such a high concentration of homelessness in the South East. So universal credit will make it even more difficult, but I think the issues around local housing allowance being frozen have been around for quite a long time, so that's already been impacting our clients a lot for quite a long time now.
So it's like a double whammy, effectively. So there were people who were affected by that freeze who then have been negatively, if not everybody, negatively affected by universal credit on top of that.
Yeah, and a lot of rough sleepers are, I mean, 85% of rough sleepers are men, and they're generally single homeless men, and their entitlement to advice and support from the local authority is pretty limited, and so their main option for getting into accommodation is to go into the private rented sector. So Hilary's already kind of rehearsed why that is a problem. So you can see why this is driving up the amount of rough sleeping that we're seeing.
Absolutely fascinating. In terms of the proportion of people who are rough sleepers who are men, why is it so high?
Well, I think it's because when you are single and don't have dependents, you've got a different set of entitlement to housing advice than if you've got dependents. And the women in a relationship breakup situation will tend to have the children, so they will go through a different homelessness route. So they are more likely to go into temporary accommodation. Whereas if you're a single man with no dependents and you only have the entitlement to housing advice, you are much more likely to end up on the streets. I mean, I think there's also an issue around women's homelessness being more hidden, because even if you're a single woman who doesn't have any dependents, the idea of going out onto the streets and rough sleeping is so terrifying that women will engage in all sorts of pretty unpleasant, unsavoury behaviour and relationships in order to avoid being on the streets.
Oh my goodness. So they might actually be more of the sort of hidden homeless that you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as Pam was saying, a large number of the women who are homeless have responsibility for children. So we know that I think it's about 1 in 40 single mothers in this country are actually homeless. Which is absolutely staggering.
Yes.
Because there are so many people who have fallen into that situation because of relationship breakdown. They have lost a home in the process, and then because of the kind of some of the issues that we were talking about, are unable to find somewhere else suitable to live, and are therefore going to the council and falling on temporary accommodation and being registered as homeless because we haven't got the social homes, we haven't got the affordable private rented homes available for them to move into.
That is extraordinary. 1 in 40 is absolutely extraordinary. David, when the Housing First policies were sort of implemented in the various countries, was there a distinction between men and women who were homeless, or was it completely agnostic?
Well, it goes according to the policy of those individual countries. Who is priority for housing, but no, I mean there's in each of the examples I've given, it's been men and women who have been housed through Housing First programs. And I think what Pam and Hilary have said about the situation for men is right. Is that they're not given the same priority that families are for very good reason. But it does make them more likely to be on the street. If you're going to have a Housing First program which is ending street homelessness, then actually you need something which is available for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're having some fantastic questions coming through from the audience, so thank you for sending those through. Do keep them coming. I'm going to pose a few to our speakers now, and we'll try not to get party political, although the first question does make that slightly challenging. We have a question from one of the audience. If the Thatcher government had not slashed spending and had not introduced the right to buy, would we have a housing crisis? Hilary,
I think in terms of the right to buy, if we were replacing the homes that were lost through right to buy, we would have much less of a problem. So it's not so much the right to buy policy in itself, but it's the fact that in some ways, the fact that people have been able to move into home ownership has been a positive thing, but the real problem is the fact that those homes weren't replaced. So the fact, as David was saying earlier, that policy has meant that the actual number of social homes available has diminished over the years has been the problem. So it's not so much right to buy in itself, it's the fact that that policy has led to a massive depletion of the amount of social housing in this country.
Right, so the lack of replacement.
Yeah, and it means that if you're trying to provide housing advice to people about what their options are, all of the housing advice that we're providing is based on the assumption that there is just far too much demand and not enough supply. And that's why local authorities, put their tin hats on and have a lot of gatekeeping around people presenting as homeless, because they just don't have enough places to put people.
It's very difficult. Pam, we have a question about how services are received on the street, and are there any issues around people sometimes being unwilling or unable to engage with the services that you're offering?
Yeah. I would love to tell you that someone is sleeping rough in a doorway, an outreach worker comes to them, shakes them by the hand and says, would you like to come into our night shelter immediately? And they say, thank you very much, that would be fantastic, and off they go. People, for all sorts of reasons, are very mistrustful of services. That might be because they've had some very poor experiences. It might also be because they feel very embarrassed and uncomfortable about admitting that they need help. They might not think that they need any help, and it means that even if you've got the most fabulous offer in the world, people are not necessarily going to see that opportunity. Also, sadly, because of some of the issues that we've described around shortages of housing, we don't always have the most amazing options in the world. And if someone comes to London, having burned their bridges in, Hull or wherever, and they don't want to go back to Hull, it means that their options in order to get into housing are extremely limited, because they need to go to Hull and demonstrate that they've got a local connection to Hull, and people just don't want to do that a lot of the time, even if it's their best option. So we are providing a lot of the time a not particularly welcome message to people about what their best options are to get off the street.
Because it's not what they want to do.
Yeah. Part of our campaign is going to speak to homeless people, so interviews with all of the people who are living rough on the streets of each of these cities. And what has come out from that for me is a lot of people have had extremely bad experiences. The level of violence in a lot of hostels is pretty horrifying. A lot of extremely bad experiences. So it's kind of what offer you provide, and I think there is, that's why I'm so wedded to Housing First as an answer for entrenched long-term rough sleeping, is that if you can offer somebody a permanent home and it's unconditional, that is a much better offer than going to somewhere where somebody's been before and essentially is sort of on the street as part of a circle, as a revolving door of going into unsatisfactory accommodation, yet not working out, or having to leave for some reason, being back on the street, and not wanting to just repeat that circle.
And so when you're actually coming into contact with them, they've been there many, many times, and the enthusiasm for engaging with something is not what it once was because of the...
No, for very rational reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I can sense that makes perfect sense to me. We've had a question about what are the barriers to people getting help, and particularly access to some of the services and online and technology. And sort of quite often you might see somebody who is homeless, who is on the street, who is either asking for money or not asking for money, but has a mobile phone, and that seems like a bit of a disconnect. Can we talk a bit about that, Pam, and how, if that's important for them to do that, and why they might maintain a mobile phone but actually not have accommodation?
Yeah, it's amazing how many rough sleepers have got mobile phones. And one of the things that you tend to see in a day centre, like the Connection, is the most enormous array of different types of plug for mobile phone chargers that people will want to use. People will have pay-as-you-go mobiles, and it is the best way that people can remain in contact with friends, family, show that they're alive, stay in touch with the world, and people will prioritise that over all sorts of other things in a really interesting way, and I can understand why they might do that. So it's not an enormous surprise to see that people have got a mobile phone, but yeah, I think there's a lot of pay-as-you-go activity going on there. So
it's a whole market that I hadn't even thought of, actually. What proportion of homeless people are in work? Hilary, you've had a question around that.
Actually, over half of the total number of, we did research with looking at homeless families and knowing that half of them are in work, because the issues aren't necessarily about the fact that they are falling on absolutely kind of rock bottom. It's the fact that their housing circumstances have changed. They might have been evicted by, as I was saying, by a private landlord, and then despite the fact that they are in work and getting a wage, they're not able to find anywhere else affordable to live. So we're seeing a large number of people who are working and kind of getting by, on the face of things, but actually are kind of living in temporary accommodation. And we see a lot of problems with people who have been moved into temporary accommodation a long way away from their places of work, or as I was saying earlier about families trying to access their child's education as well, trying to get their children into schools and going through to amazing lengths to kind of keep a job and to keep their children in school, despite the fact they might have been moved into temporary accommodation a very long way away from where they were previously living.
Goodness.
Rough sleeping in the rough sleeping population, it's a much lower proportion of people in work. I'd say it's probably about 5%. However, interestingly, because there are so many people from EU 10 countries rough sleeping in central London, they are more likely to be in work and choosing to sleep rough rather than going into accommodation because it's so expensive. They are replicating patterns that you might see in places like Romania, where it's quite normal actually for people to come into main central cities, work during the summer months when the weather is better, get as much money as they can but live in an encampment, and then go back to a rural community and live off the money they've made over the winter. So that pattern is being replicated in other parts of Europe.
Goodness me, extraordinary. So seasonal workers will be actively homeless?
Yeah.
Goodness me, that's extraordinary.
I think, I mean, your point, Pam, I'm trying to remember the figures from the Westminster Connections Week, but it surprised me how many people were in work and sleeping rough. And almost as the sort of the heroism of it, of somebody living on the street and managing to get themselves ready and hold down a job under those sorts of circumstances is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah.
But actually, then realising when you actually saw where they were working, how little the income was, and how that just meant it was absolutely impossible to rent anywhere in London on those prices. Actually, they didn't have a choice.
So there's plenty of work in central London. It's just that it doesn't pay enough for you to be able to get anywhere to live.
No. Understood. We've got absolutely tons of questions. I think I've got time for just a couple more. So I'll try to. And then what I'll ask our panel to do is to answer the others, and then we'll reply to people to make sure that your questions are answered because they're so good. So, question for you, David: has Housing First worked in a context like the UK, where there was an enormous waiting list for social housing? To start with.
Well, I think all of the places where it's worked are quite similar to the UK. I mean, I should say that there are some pilots in the UK where it is beginning to happen at the moment. So there are pilots in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Birmingham. So it's beginning to happen here. But throughout Europe, the housing pressures are actually quite similar to the ones in the UK. The housing system might not be designed in exactly the same way, but the underlying problem of supply and demand for housing is actually quite similar. So yes, I think it is. I don't think it's dissimilar to what we've got.
Okay, that's great. That's good to know, actually. And one final question. Before we sort of wrap up and ask you to think of some sort of positive glimmer of hope that you see coming in the next few years, and which may be difficult to find, but hopefully is there. So, Henry, what does affordable housing actually mean? And is the government's definition, maybe I shouldn't have saved this till last, is the government's definition actually fit for purpose?
The short answer would be no, it's not. The long answer is it's very contested. So one of the issues is that we've been talking about the government providing grant funding for building what they term affordable rent homes, and yet actually what is being built that is nominally affordable rent isn't actually always affordable to the people who really need it. That's why we need to be looking at actually building homes for social rent rather than this kind of glorified term affordable rent, which isn't really affordable. And then in terms of what affordable actually really means, we need to be looking at that in relation to kind of individuals really, and what they can actually afford in their individual circumstances. So it's you can talk about things like that it should be X% of income, but it does depend on the individual.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
It's affordable to whom, isn't it?
Exactly.
And
Yes.
I think there's what we're talking about today is the poorest, most vulnerable people in society. And there's affordable rent that simply isn't affordable to those people.
No, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I think I need to correct myself, Pam, that there are 24,000 rough sleepers in the UK. Is that right?
It's about 40,000.
40,000. Gosh, that's much higher than we thought. So apologies for getting that wrong. And it's 8,000 in London. Great. Thank you so much. So just before we kind of wrap up, I'd like you to leave us all with kind of a glimmer of hope for the future. What is the one thing you see that actually is a source? I mean, David, obviously the Housing First policy and perhaps those pilots you describe, but from sort of Pam and Hilary, the What's your one sort of positive thing that actually you think this is a sign that we might be able to turn this around and get it right?
I think in terms of the big picture structural issues and in campaigning terms, the fact it feels like we're pushing at a slightly more open door than we were a few years ago. That door did seem to be kind of very firmly kind of barred shut a few years ago in terms of the government being kind of willing to listen to some of these arguments. But it feels like the message is starting to get through, and as I say, the fact that they're talking now about funding more building of social housing, we've still got a really long way to go. We've still got a lot of campaigning to do at Shelter, but it feels like there's a more of a listening ear than there was a few years ago.
Good, that's good news. Pam?
I think the government having a rough sleeping strategy is extremely welcome. And I think the sort of momentum that is being built up around Housing First is really encouraging as well.
Great, that's really good news, thank you. And David, was there anything else you wanted to add while we have our sort of poll question in the background?
This is a solvable problem, and I think there are some signs at the moment that you're right. We've got a government which is indicated is going to have a policy. What we need is policy which extends further than that to actually stop people becoming homeless in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Very good idea. Wonderful. Well, we've asked our audience whether or not, if they've donated to a homelessness cause in the past, would they consider it now? And I think we'll give the results if you'd just like to take a vote on that. And thank you so much to our speakers. I have some quite meaty questions for you to answer offline afterwards. And we'll shortly be putting up each of your organisations' contact details if you want to get in touch and follow up. And so in terms of whether or not we persuaded the audience, 93% would support homelessness organisations. Hooray. So well done. We have moved the needle. That's great. So thank you to everybody for listening. We will follow up and send you details of the recording, and you can perhaps share and listen at your leisure in future. And we look forward to being back in 2019 with the next philanthropy series. Many thanks. Bye-bye.